Mary.
I think one of the big, one of the big barriers is fear, actually. Like, it's not necessarily having the language to discuss things. So even terms like BAME can be divisive, and it's actually difficult to even have a conversation about it sometimes, I think. And especially when you want to have a conversation in a public arena. So for example, on Twitter, which can be quite a negative space, or if you work for an organisation with a larger profile, you're obviously representing that organisation as well. So I think there are quite a lot of challenges, and fear is one of those challenges.
Absolutely. I think I'd very much agree with you. I think there's a lot been around kind of recently, you know, with Black Lives Matters, for examples, where people have been fearful about kind of speaking out around this kind of topic, you know, simply because they think that they might say the wrong thing. And I think that is kind of that does put at risk the conversations that we all need to have around kind of root causes and how we generally encourage, you know, more people of different kind of backgrounds to be able to get outside. I had within our kind of management meeting this morning, I kind of reflected on what we went through yesterday at the conference. And, you know, from an ORN Survey perspective, our mission is to help more people get outside more often. And we're passionate about that, absolutely passionate about that. But when I look at the kind of the communications that we send out and the imagery that we put on a lot of our kind of marketing literature, I'm not overly sure that we've got that well enough aligned at the moment. So from my perspective, I'll certainly be taking that back and kind of challenging the rest of our business to be able to really think about this and look and see how we do represent lots of different kind of groups that do need to kind of get outside. You know, where is that information that we have? Who's kind of looking at this from that perspective? And what can we do about it moving forward to make it much more inclusive? You know, when we say more people, getting more people outside more often, we actually mean everybody, not just kind of people that look like ourselves. So I think that's massively important.
And I think what Joe Walton was saying about the importance of having the senior leadership on side is that's a big, you know, that's a big piece as well, because if I suppose I'm kind of focusing specifically on content, but if you know that you've got the leadership team on your side, you feel more confident to have these discussions.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was fascinating to hear Joe and see what they're doing and how they're addressing those issues. And you know, I'd certainly be very much up for a conversation with Forestry England around that, so that we can learn from them and see how we can kind of progress what we do within ORN Survey.
Definitely.
Kate.
Hi, I think this builds on the previous point in terms of fear, but I think that sometimes people can think it's not their place to tackle negative responses, or they can tell themselves it's not their place, and that's probably born a little bit of fear of not quite knowing how to respond and feeling that it's easier to pretend they haven't seen something, if you know what I mean. And I think that all comes with both empowering people and providing them with the skills to know how to respond, but also reminding them that it is their place. It is incumbent upon everyone, whatever your role is, to call things out and not to kind of keep your head down and think, oh, there's probably someone else in the organisation whose job it is to respond to that. And or to another barrier that I was going to mention was actually not seeing it, not picking up, not knowing what the signals are, that so not being sensitive to those negative responses and kind of easily dismissing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. So how do we as a kind of an industry get around that? Kay, you still with us?
I am sorry, I'd gone on mute and then had a mouth issue. Well, I mean, I suppose it is it's training and holding each other to account a little bit, but it maybe shared a sense of developing a shared mission around it. Perhaps, I don't know. I'd like to hear what others think as well.
Anybody else got any? Catherine.
Hi, Lee. Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and the two barriers that people identified there, the kind of fear and it not being my place. There's some things that we did quite a lot of work around before we started working on the practical initiative. So I work with the Outward Bound Trust and did the presentation about young leaders from BAME backgrounds. So as an organisation, we did what we called diversity conversations, and rather than it being training, we framed it up as as a kind of open conversation, which was started by, okay, what are people's challenges around talking about this topic? And I think what we found by doing that throughout the organisation, and offering people opportunities to talk about some of these challenges and some of the fears that they felt, actually allowed people to recognise that others were feeling the same as them, and also just to air some of what the specific fears might be, and that, I think, allowed a lot of people to see it more as their place. I think the thing with Black Lives Matter, the phrase "silence is violence" really stood out to me and to a lot of my colleagues as well. And I noticed a lot more people on social media and in workplace settings actually starting to speak up and accepting that they might get it a little bit wrong. It didn't need to be perfect, but actually just saying something was better than saying nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, that is really, really key in terms of how we kind of move forward. Yeah. Anybody else? Any comments? Anybody kind of experienced this in practice in terms of actually coming across a barrier, and kind of would be willing to kind of talk about that in terms of you know, how they felt, what they did to overcome it, that kind of thing. Obviously, there's physical barriers in terms of you know, styes for people going out in wheelchairs and not being able to actually physically get on the path. But there's also those kind of mental barriers as well. Viv.
Hi, Lee. Thanks. I work a lot with children, young people, and I find that there is often sort of negative responses to children being outside of a school environment. So my sort of a specific example that I had was working on a session about trees and children understanding trees and the impact of nature in their local environment. And a local dog walker, a young man of, you know, minority ethnic background, of different ways, he was saying to me, oh, like, what are they doing? What are they doing out here? And I said, oh, they're learning about trees. And he said, why aren't they in school? I said, well, because they need to learn about trees by being with them and talking to them and explain what we were doing. And he had this kind of real sense of, I think there was a sense of like, oh, there is one place for the children, there's one place for the dogs, there's one place for and it was about this trying sort of fear of understanding territory as well, but also that sense that children were sort of running wild and they actually should be in school. Once I talked to him about it a little while, he really changed his attitude and the way that his whole sort of manner of engagement was really, really different. And I think it also made me feel that it would have been easier to judge him with, you know, a big dog on a big lead. And it was effective to just talk to him on a level, but also spend a bit of time. So I think sometimes the barriers are time, and I think Twitter is a brilliant example of that. Someone's talked about the death of nuance. I can't remember who coined that phrase. It's just like you don't have the time, the characters to actually have an in-depth conversation where you get beyond, I suppose, potentially violent responses.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I think it probably ties in with what we were talking about around silence as well. So, you know, you could have quite happily just ignored that and kind of got on with your day, but because you tackled that kind of up front and you had that conversation, you kind of allowed that communication to take place that said, actually, this is kind of my viewpoint and that's your viewpoint. And actually, when you start to discuss that, you kind of reach a consensus and everybody can understand. And I think, you know, from what we were saying earlier, the silence and not allowing those conversations to take place will just propagate those kind of fears all the way through. So that's brilliant on a kind of a one-to-one basis, but how do we kind of solve that on a mass basis if we need to speak to a lot of people all at the same time? Anybody thoughts on that? No? Okay, well, we'll move on to the second question in terms of potentially, oh, Kate.
I was going to ask if anyone has any particular views on kind of the effectiveness and power of kind of national campaigns in terms of communication campaigns or kind of across the sector messaging that helps stimulate those conversations and support people to have them a bit more openly, which I think I suppose thinking about this from my perspective, I work at DEFRA in the Nature and People team, and part of what I'm aware of is that sometimes things like that can actually cause a bit more pushback. And so in terms of tackling negative responses, kind of how do we, I don't know, I'm kind of muddling myself up a bit here, but that there has been some really negative press coverage and responses from some areas in society around kind of trying to to expand inclusion and diversity in the natural environment. And so although it's very I think that a national campaign might be a very powerful way to do this, I kind of curious about other people's perspectives of how that can be done while bringing people in on that journey on and not creating, not being in any way divisive, it not feeling like other people are being pushed out of the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Natasha, I see your hands up. Did you want to respond to that one directly, or have you got a different point?
Can't remember what I was going to say, but I'll just respond to that. I'll just go off the fly. But yeah, I work on social media at Forestry England, and obviously when we do our campaign content, we get a lot of pushback when we have sort of diverse photography or anything diversity related. Just immediately the trolls come out of hiding and start commenting. So it's been so important to not make our own voice the authority voice. So we don't make sweeping diversity statements or necessarily have a big campaign that we're planning for this. It's more so about raising the voices of marginalised groups. So we recently did a blog for International Women's Day about the powerful women in nature, featuring groups such as Black Girls Hike and the Wanderlust Women. So really it's, again, I sort of say it's not about our voice or creating a campaign thinking about sort of our tone of voice. Is more about sort of lifting other people's. I don't know if anyone has anything they want to add.
I think that's really interesting, Natasha, in terms of the pushback that you get from kind of your audience. A question kind of from me to you on that one: how do you measure the success of that in terms of reaching those hard to reach groups effectively?
It's quite difficult because we're still in sort of the pilot stages of interacting with these groups, and the reasoning for doing so is so that we reach audiences that we're obviously not reaching already on our channels. We don't see our visitors being largely visibly minority ethnic groups. So I think it's about reaching their followers, no matter how big or small it is, to show that we're sort of a welcoming organisation and our forests are welcoming places to visit. And tackling the negativity on social is such a big part of making social a safe space also for them to be and feel safe to follow us, because we do moderate our content and we do have our profanity filters set to strong, and we will look after our followers who are also from marginalised groups. So yeah, it's like a difficult balance between real life and online content too.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess the same question to kind of Kay as well, in terms of I'm part of a kind of a weekly call with kind of DEFRA and green space teams, just to look at what's happening on the ground, and then kind of feeding that back. And I know from a DEFRA perspective, you were looking at some advertising campaigns, I think back in the summer, when there was some trouble with kind of littering and kind of youth in park and that kind of stuff. And I think that the plan was at that stage for you guys to try and advertise in different places and put messages in different places to reach those kind of hard to reach groups. Has there been any kind of analysis on that to see whether that's actually kind of worked?
That's a really good question. I was on maternity leave when all of that was happening, and I haven't fully caught up with it, but I know that they worked with the UK Youth Rangers to help co-design with the young people a communications campaign, and I can certainly kind of try and pick up with the team that led on that to see where they got in terms of the analysis. I think that hopefully the material that was developed will be still available this year as well, and I know there has been some thought going into how we prepare for the summer and the increase of visitors again.
Yeah. Great stuff. I guess that probably leads us neatly into our kind of second question around kind of those partnership approaches. It's probably all very well our own trying to do what we do best in terms of reaching our own customers, but as I think we've established, it's probably not our customer base that we actually kind of need to reach to make it more inclusive and more welcoming. We need to expand those kind of capabilities to different groups, different organisations who have already got that kind of grouping that we can kind of tap into and then try and welcome back into the kind of the outdoors. So has anybody got any thoughts on who we could kind of work with as an industry to try and foster those links to make the outside much more welcoming and diverse for everybody, inclusive? No. Mary.
And so we could consider kind of looking at working with stakeholders who aren't in the outdoors industry. So, for example, I mean, it depends on what demographic we want to talk to. But if you're thinking about people from different ethnicities, you might want to talk to kind of music production companies or something along those lines. Thinking about kind of what different cultural references different demographics have and engaging with different stakeholders along those lines as well. Just totally thinking outside the box.
Absolutely, yeah. I think Fee's on the call as well, and I think we, in terms of bringing children into the kind of the outdoors environment as well. I know Fee does a lot with the D of E, so maybe there's something from kind of learning what happens within those organisations and how they communicate that we could all kind of learn from. Kate.
Sorry, I'm saying too much. I should sit back.
That's all right. No, that's fine. You crack on.
I was actually just going to say that as well as thinking about reaching out to other sectors, I think music and art sector is a really good point. But there are other partnerships that I'd be curious to know how people might recommend approaching them in terms of people that haven't started on this journey, but with whom we will depend if we're going to deliver it. So I'm thinking of farmers, land managers, rural communities in many different forms who may not see it as yet as their role to be doing this, but on whom we will depend, because if local communities are not themselves prepared to kind of come on the journey, then it's going to be tricky, even if we are working in partnership with lots of great organisations to bring communities out.
Definitely. Mary.
Actually, Kay, just off the back of that, do you have a relationship with things like the NFU and Farmers Weekly and that kind of thing? The reason I ask is my dad and I come from a farming background. I know how influential things like Farmers Weekly are, etc.
That's a really we will be speaking to NFU in more detail about all of this actually this afternoon and in more detail next week as well. So but that's a really good comment in terms of Farmers Weekly and actually just working really closely with them on this.
Yeah, it's quite specific, the media that farmers, I mean, you can't generalize the whole sector, I know, but they are quite specific about the kind of media that they follow or kind of engage with.
Yeah,
sometimes absolutely. Not every single farmer, you can't generalize, but
does anybody else have any views on which either organisations or sectors that we could potentially work with to make it more kind of the outside more inclusive? Ria?
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to refer back to a comment that Joe made, the forestry, just talking about working with partnerships and organisations that are already engaging with the outdoors and with the environment and just amplifying those voices, because I just think that's a really positive and powerful way of partnering.
Most definitely, yeah. Okay, anybody else with any ideas? Fee, have you got any thoughts from the D of E perspective? You're on mute, Fee. No, maybe not. Okay, so in terms of the kind of the last question that we need to kind of report back on, I guess part of that's kind of included in terms of the who do we want to partnership with, but from a stakeholders perspective, I think Mary's already mentioned, you know, getting the senior leadership teams involved at an early stage throughout that kind of process is quite key. Is there other stakeholders that we feel need to be included on that list to actually kind of engage in some action, whether that be kind of governmental agencies or you know, local community officers, that kind of thing? Is there any kind of stakeholders that we feel as though we need to approach in order to get some action taken?
Lee, I've come in very late on this, so I don't know what you've already talked about, and I have managed to sort out my microphone now.
Excellent, thank you.
One thing that's been on my mind a little bit is this: if it's completely off what you've been talking about, do tell me to shut up. As a writer, it could be, and as you know, I'm quite keen to get the right messages across, but I'm very aware of the mass of information out there that sometimes it's very negative I think can appear very negative to new visitors to the outdoors. I think it can be a sort of you're not welcome here, although it's not intended to come across like that. And I'm wondering whether there's a way for organisations to work with the writing community to provide information that's useful, that might help people not make mistakes, basically. So you know, say a national park had a web page that gave information on certain aspects that they wanted to emphasise. So maybe there was an issue around car parking when it snows, or visiting certain locations because they're sensitive and getting damaged, and whether, I think as a writer, sometimes it's easy if you know the area you're writing about, but if you're visiting a new area, it can be quite difficult to get the information you want if you want to say the right things.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that part of that came out in the debate that we've had recently around kind of the Countryside Code, for example. That's always been seen as quite a kind of a no, you can't do anything. But with the refresh that's coming kind of in time for Easter, hopefully some of that has been kind of addressed. But it's really interesting what you say in terms of reaching that kind of sector of writers to be able to start encouraging people to get outside. And it's not just a preserve for some; it's actually for everybody. And how do we kind of get people out there as well? One of the questions that we had for you, Fee, was around your work that you do with the D&V.
Yeah.
And you know, children are, you know, traditionally a fairly hard to reach group, and you know, in terms of us making it very kind of inclusive for everybody, what kind of experiences have you had, or things that you've learned to be able to take those kids out on adventures, and what kind of, you know, feedback do you get from them once they do that?
I think the first barrier is quite often it's not for me. So I can't remember who was talking earlier today, and they said that if it's not something that somebody's family does, so it's and when I worked in a school, that was obviously easier because you built up a rapport with the families as well as the students. So so that's the first barrier, is it's not seen as something for everybody, which I think D&V does quite a good job of tackling that. The next thing is there's so much information out there now about what you need to go outside, but there's not very much that says, actually, here's the minimum you can get away with.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a balancing act between safety and encouragement, but gear has always been our main issue for getting youngsters outside, having access to equipment, having, you know, just having a raincoat, or having a pair of shoes to wear, or just the basic things. So, and I think people now think, oh, I can't do it because I can't afford all of that. So I'm quite keen at the moment to try and get across that you can do things safely. Yeah. You know, so gear is something that I think is quite off-putting for people, and just a general understanding, really.
Yeah, and I guess that's why that kind of partnership between the Outbound Trust and kind of the North Face worked quite well, because, you know, Outbound Trust had that ability to be able to take people outside, and North Face managed to give them the kit to be able to go off and enjoy that at the same time as well. So they were fully prepared, had everything, and they were with the right people to go off and experience that. So I think that's pretty key.
Mary.
So just thinking again about partnerships. So in a way, it's really great that the North Face kind of supported the that partnership, but at the same time, it does give a message that to have outdoor gear, you have to buy. You know, North Face is fantastic gear and it does the job, but it's very expensive. So there's also the potential there to look at partnerships with, I mean, something even like Tesco's. I mean, Tesco's do great raincoats. My kids wear Tesco's raincoats. They do the job, you know, and perhaps we need to, that message needs to come across to parents as well, that you don't have to buy everything from kind of high value.
No, you're
brands,
absolutely right, Mary. There are quite a lot of lower priced shops that right in the wool outdoor people might look down on, but actually, I mean, Mountain Warehouse, I've got some thermals that I've had from there that have lasted me for years and years and years. And there are organisations out there like Gift Your Gear who are great for. We've had lots of gear off them to help youngsters, and they send seconds. They work through a donation scheme, so that's quite good. So there are things out there. It's just. Yeah, but you're right. It's about messaging, Mary. It's about saying to people about what they need.
Yeah. But just to say that these are the North Faces, etc. They have a huge role to play, and they're doing a fantastic job. But there is something in there around the messaging, though.
Yeah, Liz, did you want to come in on that one?
Hi there. Yes, I'm just looking at the kind of the really big picture here. So it seems to me that we've got all of the providers and outdoor organisations, and then we've got all sorts of groups and individuals that need or want to access the outdoors, and we want to connect with them. And there are some really common themes and barriers. So kind of for me, the things that we find at National Trust is transport, it's time, it's all the classic things. And then from the other side, we're thinking all the things everybody's talked about today, you know, gosh, am I doing it the right way? You know, where do I begin? There's so many different organisations. And I just feel like there's something around some kind of central organisation or central way of connecting and reducing the sort of duplication. Because we're all doing the same things. Yeah. A million times in a million different ways, and yes, these conferences connect all of that up, but I'm still sitting down with a one-on-one group or a National Trust property, and I'm trying to connect them, and I'm not sure how to broker those partnerships in a brilliant way, and those groups. I just feel like there's something around training, there's something around nationally funding kind of transport kit. I just feel like there's a conversation to have to say, is there a middleman here or something that brings this together nationally? So if I'm an organisation, I don't know, in a city, I can find out what national parks can offer me, what forestry is offering this week, you know, what, and vice versa. I can find out groups that have put their hand up and said, hey, you know, we want, you know, is there a safe place for us to walk or cycle, and how do we do it, and who do I talk to? Is there something? I don't know. That's what's coming across for me, and I know that's just chucking it out in the middle of this conversation, but yeah, I'd love to hear people's views on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think from an ORN perspective, there's a role that we play within there. I mean, we're trying at the moment to look at it from a kind of a research perspective. So rather than one group saying, actually, I want to do some research into kind of disadvantaged kind of groups, a few of us are now starting to put our hands in the pockets and say, actually, why don't we just fund one piece of research rather than we have 5 or 6 different pieces? Yeah. So we're coming together to do that kind of stuff, and certainly with the kind of the Get Outside initiative that we've got, we're creating those kind of pages in county format and activity format, so people can see and understand what's going on and where. And we've originally kind of put those in place to get us through the kind of the COVID situation, so that people could see what the rules were and when they could and couldn't go out, and what they could do and where they could do it. We're looking at expanding that out once COVID ends to actually make that a kind of a proper directory of what you can do and where you can do it, and then provide advice to all sorts of different people with different kind of skill sets as to what they might want to do when they get there. So I think it's coming, and I think that, you know, COVID has given us an opportunity to press that reset button and look to see what's important and how we might be able to join up as an industry. On the Get Outside pages, we've got many kind of organisations that are fed in. So we don't want to be responsible for the content, but we're happy to provide that platform so that people can come on and then, you know, share that information. There's hundreds of thousands of people visit those pages on a weekly basis. So we're hoping that might become that kind of gateway for people to be able to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, I suppose it is that, but it's around training. It's around yeah, just bringing together so that it's not quite so sort of overwhelming or kind of disparate, you know, on both sort of sides, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And training's on the agenda for ORN to be able to look at as well, because I think we see that as a vehicle to be able to provide that independent sector training to allow people to be able to come up into that organisation, and then we can kind of look at that from an inclusive and a diversity perspective as well. So yeah, independent of what everybody else is doing. But,
great.
Cool. Kay.
Oh, I was just going to second Liz's point in terms of kind of that it feels like there is a need for a kind of practical join up, and that also, I just linking it back to kind of tackling negative responses. I think that kind of really creating that community support across the sector and more broadly, and kind of harnessing a wave of momentum by having a joint way of approaching it, and a sense that we're all really working at it together, will hopefully help with that tackling negative responses. It almost it kind of, otherwise it risks all being kind of disparate little movements that can easily be lost when life goes back to normal post-COVID, or when other things pick up attention, and so in some ways kind of joining everyone together to kind of form a bigger kind of national momentum, I think will be important to maintain the gain that's been already made and is being made across the board.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely second that. I think we've got about a minute left. Could I get Philip on the line just to kind of go through, and hopefully he's made some notes that we can then summarise within in the plenary section. But Philip, can you just give us a kind of a recap of the things that we kind of looked at?
Yes, no problem. Lee, nothing like being put in a spot, but I do have notes. I'm just going to go through each question. So what are the barriers? So a good lot of discussion on the barriers mostly. So we talked about fear, the fear of not knowing how to respond, pretending that they haven't seen anything, and things like the terms, BME, etc. being divisive. And even then, whenever you come to discussing on public platforms, have the fear of sort of the pushback. The barriers then for, I suppose, for individuals, not being familiar with the concept of visiting the outdoors, you know, this might not be something that you do as a family tradition or something that you're used to. Having the right gear, the right transport, the right time, knowing where to begin, etc. So the communications wise, well, I suppose within not knowing, one thing that was mentioned was not knowing what the signals are makes it hard to identify what the issues are. So within the industry, or within this industry, how can we tackle those issues? We discussed the need to provide and empower individuals with skills to call things out, not bury our heads in the sand. And to do this, we need training, additional training to allow us to be held to account and to meet sort of that shared ambition. We talked a lot about messaging. That was one of the key things, and I suppose a focus that maybe there needs to be a national campaign, so it's not left up to individual organisation voices, and it avoids the duplication of research. And we talked there about sort of gathering a national momentum on that. There was also mention on how the information is expressed. It's expressed differently, and I think it was Fee that talked about, you know, sort of bringing in different expertise. So, for example, writers to come and, you know, sort of teach you how to word it, so that the mass of information doesn't appear negative, where in some cases it might do. And I suppose the silence of not allowing those conversations to take place helps the issues to grow. So it really is key to try and get that messaging clear. Talk about partnership and what other stakeholders need to be involved. Mainly talking about going beyond the ethnic or different demographic groups, and including other mediums or other sectors, for example, education, arts or music. Also looking into other partnerships with farmers, land managers, rural communities who may not see their role as helping to promote the outdoors to all, but actually that role is vital in sort of welcoming those that aren't familiar with the outdoors to that area. So that could be engaging with local communities or with NFU or Farmers Weekly. So I think that was probably hopefully that summarised it well enough for everybody.
That's a fantastic set of notes, Philip. Thank you ever so much.
Is that all right?
I think we've just been given a kind of a notice to go back into the main room. So thank you ever so much for everybody that kind of participated, and I hope everybody enjoyed the kind of discussion. I think all we need to do now is we should have a return button at the top of the Teams chat. So if you just click on that, we should go straight back into the main meeting. But thank you ever so much to everybody. That's been really great.